Morrow of the Golden Age, Chapter 16. In the Kingdom of Judea, which had no living king due to the careful machinations of the Ptolemies, Dion was convinced that everyone looking to him for leadership and triumph would be pleased if he were to bring the sword down upon the local population. Before we jump to the deeds everyone likes to dwell upon here, I should explain why he thought he was correct. I rely here on his own account of events, written some years later, but after travelling a great distance to find a colleague of mine who resides in Judea, I was able to confirm much of it. Dion's reasoning stemmed from the presence of Scions of Gold sages in his retinue, who had been making assessments of the religious landscape of the Ptolemaic Empire. Overall, it had been to their liking, because Egypt was a place that had been given proper religious instruction, and hence did not have much trouble identifying the gods. Although like the Italics, they preferred to use their own names and conventions for honouring them. The Ptolemies had permitted the Egyptians' older religious ideas to merge with newer information to create a pantheon on the borders of reality, filled with dependable facsimiles of real gods and with mythical entities arising from the curse of the Nile throughout history. However, the Scions of Gold had not been successful in bringing the people of Alexandria into the flock of Manos, of the people updated with the most true knowledge of the cosmos there was now. This frustrated them, and they bore this frustration to Dion, who reflected it back many-fold with his uncaring ear. Still, the prince had developed a sense of guilt, since he was duty-bound to aid the Scions of Gold, as they were representatives of his empire, and so he agreed to a certain scheme of theirs that I shall detail shortly, though you have likely heard of it already. First, allow me to point out how it was his separation of national priorities from his own wishes that kept him engaged with the project of Manos despite his instincts, and that is one of his finer qualities. Although his detractors will attribute the quality to Spartacus first, and not credit Dion with having successfully learned his father's difficult way of being, not noticing how most people try and fail to act with even a partial measure of the composure and world-facing reasoning this family commanded. I put it to you that his dutiful nature was not only the influence of his father at work, but the tempering effect of power passing him by. In many kingdoms, Dion would have been granted the rank of king, and his hosts made him well aware of this since it amused them to torment foreigners of which they were jealous. For Dion this was difficult to digest, there can be no doubt, yet also there is no record of Dion's bitterness on the topic. And I put it to you that this is both due to his stoic character, and was in turn a cause for him to turn cold and detach himself from his own wants, knowing that said wants spelled the deepest trouble for his family and people. Still, we cannot say that he did not possess a great fire that must have been fueled to some extent by his circumstances. Rather than a bestial rage, it was captive like wind in a sail. He would make sure that it was his enemies and not his allies who were burned, once he saw clearly which category a person fit. The Scions of Gold had alerted Dion to the presence of heretical religious ideas which had taken hold in the region, and it so happened that practitioners of these ideas were sworn enemies of the Ptolemies. To a certain degree, it was the same reason they were so distant from both of these parties. This group was the Judeans, descendants of the Phoenicians who once ruled the eastern end of the Inner Sea. At first, they appeared significantly more advanced in their religion than the Egyptians, because they rejected almost all gods without question, something not even those interested in the way of Manos could understand at the time. The Judeans were, we now know, in possession of various relics from the original colonization of the lands, which informed them about the nature of the cosmos better than most, although they decided to keep these truths secret after the gods began to influence the rest of the world, for fear that the will of the cosmos would turn the world against them. In their hearts, they kept the will of Manos alive for a long time. But the Scions of Gold were ultimately disappointed to learn how Manos' truth had been corrupted over thousands of years. Now the Judeans dismissed Manos too, and worshipped only one deity. Because they are secretive, they don't like to say who this deity is, and thus it took almost 1 year for the Scions of Gold to determine the answer, Yimo, known by the name High Lord, and revered as if all creation was his own initiative. Furthermore, they believed that the narrow territory they inhabited was the place where Yimo's spirit dwelt, and therefore he could not be worshipped or even properly known anywhere else in the world. That is why they had built a large city called Hierosolima, and they did not like to move away from it. Even under the dominion of countless other cities and empires, they maintained that their region was the Kingdom of Judea, and were largely successful in bringing this belief to the modern age, in which now it was used to reject the rule of Alexandria. Since this had been going on for a long time, the Scions of Gold urged Dion to conquer those lands, so that something could be done to avert any disaster their misuse of cosmic power would bring. And the Ptolemies wished nothing else than to see this enemy humbled, so they dispatched the prince with limitless supplies and freedom to operate as he wanted. At last, Dion had a way to satisfy all the voices in his ears, and maybe also the voice on the inside that was insisting he take the fate of the world into his hands, not so that it was to be outside the reach of the gods, only for the enjoyment of having it himself, indeed the very same vice that makes the gods so mischievous. Dion set Hierosolima to siege in the spring of 175 prior, and ordered that all of the people come forth to hear the word of Manos. The city complied. Tens of thousands came and collected around Dion's camp like a beard upon a face. Dion led the efforts to speak with the foremost citizens, and was angered greatly when he learned that they were steadfastly refusing to carry Yemo's name on their tongues, let alone any other truths his family had brought to light. His carelessness for religion was replaced with fury that he was not being obeyed, or so those who saw what happened said. Dion took up a spear and threatened an elderly man with death if no honest account of Judean beliefs was given. The man spoke for a while, detailing various things openly. However, he was not convinced to come around to the topic of the tripartite or the Golden Age. The Judeans were voicing their desire to be left to their ways on this topic, and I think Dion might have wished to do the same if a political solution could be found, but that was not discussed that day. Dion consulted his sages in the camp briefly, then returned and used his spear to execute the elderly man. The crowd was quietened. In this moment, we see the sort of change that a principled man can undergo when his principles are at odds with the scenario. Some will fault Dion for not being able to concoct a method that would have the Judeans submit. However, consider this. What methods of achieving this had he been witness to prior? What method did the Bosporans generally use? It was the awe of sudden conquest that won their empire, and it would just as soon have fallen apart had the prince's late father not seen the utility of Golden Age philosophy. And so here we have the synergy of these two ideas, of violence and of truth, and Dion brought the former to bolster the latter. Each voice who protested his justice was struck down, and within a very short time there was a rush to escape the meeting. Dion took his soldiers forward to seize people and demand their surrender, and quite often they still refused, even with a sword at their necks, which was a fatal commitment. If Dion had a lapse in judgment here, then surely one must consider that poor judgment was also on display among those who victimized themselves thus. I do not have a strong opinion on the matter, and will happily grant that the growing pursuit and massacre was a stain upon the prince's record, and I reject the claim that this was in fact a battle of sorts, simply because some of the townspeople armed themselves. These claims aim to see past the waste of blood that day by thinking of it as a military need. Yet I have always found that Dion's writings are brilliant, and not at all like his manner of speech in person. And likewise, the character in those writings is wise and lush with youthful thoughts, nothing like the dog who snapped at the heels of the Judeans after only a day of disagreement. Admittedly, those writings came after this dark business. I hope I have given account of my position, since people like to commit to one side or the other as steadfastly as the belligerents in the tale itself. Most of the crowd fled into the city, and there they sometimes put up spirited resistance by equipping concealed arms. The city had been preparing for events such as these, but they had not committed to training or organizing themselves to make good use of their tools. Therefore, the massacre was merely slowed rather than halted. Dion gave his soldiers permission to sack the city, although most goods worth taking had already been moved to Alexandria by punitive raids in previous years. A large number of slaves were made, and the majority of the city was burned down over the course of a week. a portion was spared by Dion's order, and it is often said that this order came after he spent 2 days inside a large temple the Judeans maintained, although only historians claim this, not the sources. There was certainly a large temple in the city, with many enlightening people in residence, as I have visited it in its restored form myself. There are vaults below it that, when Dion arrived, would have stored the records from which the Judean cult of Yimo arose. It is from these records that many of the finer details of Yimo's involvement in the creation would be learned, which I have already done you the service of including in my earlier tellings. I think it is entirely possible that Dion was able to learn these things himself in that vault, and his fury was blunted against the mystery of the cosmos for a short time. Hence the city stood in some capacity, its central district in salvageable condition, and since there was no specific order about what should become of it, Dion felt that he could claim the city as a tyrant and rule it himself. The envoys of the Ptolemies came to request a tributary agreement. However, they came upon a sight so pitiful that their only thought was to escape it. Indeed, Hierosolyma was now a place of burned fields and roads blocked with corpses, whose meagre remaining lands were worked by slaves under armed guard, and whose buildings were mostly blackened rubble. Furthermore, the slaves were rife with various diseases, and more died by the day. Inside the Judean temple, Dion never caught wind of any reaction from his would-be lieges at all. Some work would eventually be done to tidy the scene, but Dion was mostly content to debate politics with the survivors of the city's old leading men, who were experts at debating minor things in much the same way as Dion. Likewise, the army was so utterly committed to holding their diminishing prizes in check that they could hardly be used for any state business, especially with coinage in short supply. Furthermore, the city was not the only place that was considered a part of Yimo's holy domain by the Judeans, so there were several towns and villages who had received refugees and been inflamed against Dion and his company. These people would happily give their lives to retake Hierosolyma, and Dion, the man and not the mind, would happily take them. So came the war of 175 to 174, which is not well documented, although we know that the majority of Dion's force was retired by its dramas, either to death or to ingratiation into the city as its ruling class during Dion's reorganization. Attacks were regular, and while we can glean that none were successful, the fighting was desperate and bloody. Disease claimed more lives, and indeed coming to liberate the city only hastened the ferrying of sickness back to the outposts where the Judeans were still at large. There is no knowing how many were killed, but proportionally we are told by Dion himself that 1/2 of the region's entire peoples were killed during this single year. He freely admitted to benefiting from this and having ordered many killings himself, while with his other hand lamenting the situation and professing to have investigated many other options in private. Take his word as you will, but I find the inconsistency to not be a sign of dishonesty, but a window into a character whose nature was like twisted fibers of rope fraying at one end. By his own admission also, he was planning on fleeing the town with his remaining soldiers, because the harsh climate and awful fighting was going to result in ultimate victory for those of the Judeans who somehow remained alive. However, Dion was rescued, if by the grace of the gods we do not know, because a relief force arrived from Crete with thousands of soldiers who had been bound to Spartacus at Tanais, and they were put to use to flatten the Judean field camps and scatter their organized resistance to areas far from Hierosolyma. That is not to say resistance was stamped out, for this was only the end of the war's first phase. But from here on there was no sufficient force that existed to threaten the city existentially, and the fight would take place primarily to the north, where there was fertile land and flowing Seleucid coin to ensnare desperate men into whatever warring the coin-bearers whimmed. We have records of which battles took place here, from which we see there were many, and that Dion was present and victorious at each. This seems to have had little impact on the willingness of the hinterlands to rebel against him, whenever they mustered the arms and supplies to do so. No doubt onlookers across the border were intervening, and it is true that the gods were likely attempting to bring this folly upon the Judeans as retribution for centuries of rejection. Did those same gods not foresee what Dion and his family were enacting in the same vein? They may not have, as those cosmic windows are distant and limiting, which explains many of the problems the gods have had historically, and why so few people can ever be in their focus at one time. Still, since there was no reason for the Judeans to not come and accept Manos' word, we must conclude that they had been poisoned by promises from one power or another. Since the region of Palestine came to be supplied with food by Bosporan allies and with fresh troops by the Ptolemies, who gave away their men to Dion's command only when he paid off the correct officials, the situation stabilized and the continued struggle to muzzle the general population became as routine as gymnastic drill. News of all these things made its way back to Europe, where it found Pairisades restless for another campaign. Hearing that his nephew was making such a bloody name for himself, the call to adventure became unbearable. During the year 174, the king assembled the Lithosis and Bosporan armies at Apollon. The latter force was recruited primarily from said city, with many young Getae men being equipped in the Greek fashion, with tall shields and long spears. Still, their pride was not absent, for those who had falxes in their family took them and strapped the blades upon the face of their shields, making for a memorable and fearsome emblem of their brutal heritage. Some officers tried to undo this. However, Pairisades intervened to graciously win over his new recruits by admiring their ferocious appearance. This is the way he had always acted, but it came across as more improper while he wore the teal cloak of the king. Indeed, the king had not changed with the coming of his 40th year, nor did he look likely to change with the approach of his 50th. Adventure it would be then, for whoever liked it and whoever didn't equally. Diotrephes counted among the latter group, and now he had no other king to complain to about it. For us, this is a shame, for his reports are less candid and more official in nature, so we shall have to judge the mind of the king more by his achievements than by his company. His many Getae followers were likely happy to learn that the king's wish was to conquer old enemies of the Getae who resided in territory to the northwest of Apollon. This was the region between the Alps and the Sarmatian mountains. The peoples there had been the enemies of Apollon for many centuries, but that was now to cease with a final crescendo. It was not mere conquest the king had in mind, however. He had taken quiet interest in the process that had brought his son, Doraius, to be de facto king of Philippopolis in Macedonia, and wanted to emulate it himself. Therefore, he had also put out an appeal to the disenfranchised of the Getae domain, and after finding too few left with the capacity to become colonists, he ended up bringing in additional volunteers from other parts of the empire. This column of people was to trail behind the Apollon army, which was in turn to stay behind the king's Lithosis or similarly styled vanguard of several thousand riders. Enormous crowds came to see this procession out of the city in a 3-day ceremony of much feasting, and all the people became enamored with the idea that the military might which had conquered their citadel so convincingly would now be expanding the city's own glory in the dangerous northern lands of the world. And for others, to know how important this mission was to the progression of Manos' restoration brought them to the point of weeping. The nobility did not enjoy seeing this outpouring of support, and privately they knew that it was the promises the king and his dynasty had made for material gains that the people were truly fixated upon, and these gains were things said nobles did not usually see as fair, which is a view shared generally in other places where similar things were tried at various points in history too. Whether or not they disliked the proceedings, they were subject to the ripples upon history they made just as much as anyone else, and they would be forced to witness feats that their inward view of the world could not be sanely reconciled with. So we begin to describe a journey of many years that the king took his followers upon, towards the dark lands of Germania proper, where enemies of the First Lands had once settled and still festered, clotting the flow of human spirit with their ignorance. Such is how it was put by Gwena Greekspeaker at a meeting of the Chariskos Demiurgi. This body was by now quite well staffed with forest folk nobles, who I should note were not considered especially noble by anyone, including themselves. Indeed, Chariskos was growing in tandem with the portfolio of the world itself. Gwena was not able to travel elsewhere by this time, as the sorcery that had sustained her was fading away in direct proportion to the cultivation of Manos' words. She had once set out from her village to search for signs of hope among the fallen humans of the world, the half-men, and over the course of 100 years she had at last found a way to make those half-men whole, giving herself up for this and diminishing away. This meeting provides the final official record of her sought-after sayings, so I will conclude here with my favourite of her remarks. Time is passing, still. We are not beyond the world. This reminds us of what we were meant to be. We are not gods, but we are of gods. We are not this world, but the world is of us. Time was given to each person to be. When you cease to be, you will give the world to another. Your power will join with the earth, and the world will be what your soul wishes, a little. And when all wish for order, that is what time will be, like pure water. There will be no part that looks dirty, and no part that does not quench your thirst. To become this is what we are living for. Focus on only the mark your death leaves upon this thing, so that you can become the pure water dripping onto the earth and changing it back. Back to the time when everything we hate had not come to be, before your doubts. Become a paragon of the second golden age. That is what I say to myself when I am weak, when I am unsure. And I always see it, the true way. I'm so happy that I'm nearly there. My sacrifice will be enjoyed in a time that cannot end, forever, and the gods will have all that time to ponder their mistakes, and learn that the best thing in the cosmos is outside of it. It is our world. Never be jealous of anything, for here you are, and this cannot be taken from you. Whether you agree with her sentiments or not, since I first heard that final remark, I have found myself recalling it frequently. It is common for historians to be accompanied in life by the many things they have learned, and this is one I find indispensable, so take it also and see if you enjoy it as much as I. And let it be known that Gwenna Greekspeaker perished happily in the year 173 prior, if what happened to her and her kin after this point can rightly be called perishing. With this soft note set to record, I turn our hearts away from gold and back to war in dark places, gripping the promise that all I will say next was in service of good things which will one day come to pass.